Is the Christian God really better than the Hebrew God, the Israelite God? Is the Old Testament God really worse than the New Testament God? Well, in some ways, you can easily point out the Old Testament God with all his genocide and things of that nature and say that that God is worse than the Christian God. And that Jesus came, which is what many Christians will teach, is that Jesus came to give a New Testament of the true, loving, forgiving, patient God of Jesus that is different from the Old Testament God, or is correcting what the Pharisees and Sadducees had made out of the Old Testament God, and he was correcting it to give people this New Testament. But in this instance, what we see is the New Testament God, the Jesus God, is actually worse than the Old Testament God. You see, when it comes down to slavery, there's a totally different mindset from the Old Testament to the New Testament. You see, in the Old Testament, in Leviticus 25, it talks about how if you make a slave of one of your kinsmen, then of your kinsmen, you are only supposed to allow them to be a slave for 7 years. And in the seventh year, you are supposed to free them and then give them all this money and land and cows and whatever in order for them to start their life or continue their life. Because most of the time, it was out of some sort of debt. But when you continue to read Leviticus 25, it specifically goes into the case of saying that of the foreigners amongst you and the foreign nations, you are to buy your slaves to have in perpetuity as property and pass them down to your sons. You are also, if you beat that slave and they don't die within the first couple of days, then the master is not to be punished. But if they die after that, then the master is still not to be punished. But if they die within the first couple of days, then the master is to be punished. But in no time frame, at no time frame, did it ever say to go and make your slaves into believers of the Old Testament God, of Yahweh. Those people were allowed to maintain their belief in their God because the Israelite people understood what Deuteronomy says, that of Yahweh, Elion gave Jacob, Israel, to Yahweh. All the other gods received land and the people that lived in that land, whereas Yahweh only received the people of Jacob, of Israel. And so when they had slaves, they didn't force them into their religion. They allowed them to stay outside of their religion because they knew that these people were foreigners. They were not part of their tribe. But when we get to Christianity, the Jesus message changed. The Jesus message here, it tells them slaves, and I think this is in Ephesians 6. Jesus tells the slave, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and sincerity of heart, just as you would obey me. Which is to say that the slave can be converted into Christianity, that you can have people who believe in the same God that you believe in as your slaves, and those slaves are to remain in obedience of their masters, whether they are good or bad. I think is in Chronicles, whether they are good or, I mean, not Chronicles, Corinthians, whether they are good or bad, you are still supposed to stay under that master and be good and respectful and fearful of that master, which brings in a level of mental slavery that wasn't part of the slavery of the Old Testament God. This definitely makes the Old Testament God better than the New Testament God, because at least there wasn't a mental slavery that was also pushed on the people. And they didn't enslave their own people who believed in the same God, because they believed that their God that anybody who believed in what they believed needed to be treated a certain way. The only people who were allowed to become believers of their God were women who were conquered by those Israelites. And so that's where you see the verses that says kill all the men, kill all the women, kill the baby boys, kill any woman that's known a man. But for the young ladies who haven't known a man, you can make them into your wives. This is where Ruth says that your God will become my God. Only the women were allowed to do this. And that was done through slavery, through wife slavery, sex slavery. That's the only way it was done. But in this New Testament, it's a whole different scale. It's completely different. And the fact of the matter is, it has been more detrimental to the people in these last 2,000 years of believing in the Christian version of God and this idea of slavery than it has been for any other time frame. Slavery has only been outlawed for the majority of the world for the last 150 plus years. That's about it. No more than that. So slavery in this modern age had made people believe in the same God that their oppressors believed in. So when the slaves said, Jesus saved me, Jesus helped me, this Jesus was absent, is what most people say. But in truth, the Jesus wasn't absent. In this version of God, this Jesus was saying that, no, I am not going to help you and give you your freedom. What I'm going to give you is this, to have this belief in me that when you get to heaven, we'll all be equal, because there is no free or bondman, male or female, in the kingdom of heaven. So don't worry about being a slave now. Don't worry about the treatment that you're receiving now, the punishment that you're receiving now. Stay under that and just be happy that when you die, you may possibly get to go to heaven. And in heaven, then you'll have your freedom. That is far worse than anything concerning slavery that the Old Testament ever taught. And this beguiled so many people of indigenous lands who were conquered, colonized, or purchased and enslaved, because that legacy continues on today, where you have people who come from this, whose ancestors were enslaved, still believing in this God that told them that your slavery is ordained by this God, and that you are to be happy in your slavery, that you are to be obedient in your slavery. And so as we look at people today, people are still maintaining that style of belief. Don't believe me? Just in America alone, just America. Look at what happens when you have a Karen act an ass towards a black person. That black person is trying to argue with her, trying to reason with her, trying to debate with her. Not immediately calling the police, not immediately throwing that person off their land or away from their car or whatever the situation is. They are still submitting themselves to this Karen because it was identified here. It is identified here. Now, when you see a Karen approach another person of like tribe, that person oftentimes will throw them off or immediately call the police, because they are not going to put up with it. They don't have to stay respectful. They don't have to stay in sincerity of heart or fear. They recognize that they were not the slave. And so for them, they don't submit to them. But over and over again, black people who grew up in this Christian mindset will continue to submit to the oppressive situation and the oppressive nature of this Christian God, the Jesus God. And many people will say that, no, that's not what Jesus taught, but it's in your Bible. It's what he said, according to your story. So you cannot deny it. Just want y'all to think about that. And I got a part 2 that I'm going to talk about, but it's going to be on a whole nother video. So subscribe to the channel, get a subscription or membership. And always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.